Welcome to this lecture on equity and trusts law. In this lecture and in this series of lectures, we're going to have a little look at this concept of tracing, so tracing and following, and sort of apply this to problem questions. It's very much a problem question kind of topic. So I'm going to go through the rules of tracing and how it works, and then work this out in terms of some problem questions, and hopefully that'll be helpful to see how it applies in practice. So in this series, I've got an order of things which I'm going to go through. So this is our little contents of this series of lectures. So first of all, I'm going to do a little introduction to tracing, seeing how it fits into the wider picture of equity and trusts law, and then explain through the tracing rules, the specific rules that you would encounter when applying to a tracing problem question, and then go through a set of problem questions to see actually how these rules kind of work together and how they work in practice. So first of all, let's have a little introduction to tracing. So this little map here is showing where tracing kind of fits in the broader scheme of trust law. So tracing fits into the remedies sort of side of trust law. So this is a little flowchart for how you would approach solving remedies and finding what remedies would apply in a case. So first of all, you would require a breach of trust. Now, on proving this breach of trust, there are different remedies which would be available for different types of breach of trust. So depending on what type of breach it would be, you might get a certain list of remedies which the beneficiary could choose from. So once that's decided, you then move on to the section of tracing. So this is tracing to decide where the assets are, who owns the assets, and what kind of claims can be held or made by the beneficiary to these assets. So this will then lead to the question of potentially a proprietary remedy. If the beneficiary knows where their assets are, they might have a proprietary claim to those assets. Now, if a proprietary claim is not possible, or it would be not beneficial for the beneficiary to make a proprietary claim, they can also make a personal claim. So this would be a personal remedy against the trustee or against a third party. Now there's a little arrow between proprietary remedy and personal remedy. Now this is often because a proprietary remedy is often more beneficial to actually get their assets back, and sometimes they might have to rely on a personal remedy if that's not the case. And the real question of what remedy might be suitable would be the question of potentially if a party's insolvent or if you can't trace an asset. And an insolvency and not being able to trace the asset is really important in the beneficiary being able to actually work out what remedy they can claim, because they can't do remedies which would overlap and give them back more sort of compensation or assets than they would deserve. So the beneficiary can elect a remedy. So this question of tracing is very important in solving and trying to work out what remedy would actually be available and what remedy would be best for the beneficiary. Okay, so in this little introduction to tracing, I'm also going to lay out a number of steps which can be used to solve a tracing problem. Now, there are a number of things which you have to consider with parts of tracing. So these might be requirements for tracing, or how the tracing rules work, or actually what the conclusion is to tracing and what it could lead to. So I've got a number of steps here which sort of apply to different parts of tracing. So the first one is proprietary interest. So the party which is trying to trace assets has to have some sort of proprietary base or proprietary interest in the assets. You've then got two parts, number 2 and number 3. The first one being following. Can they follow the assets? Or can you trace the assets? And I'll explain these two concepts as we go through the next couple of videos. Number 4 is then the rules of actual tracing. So what assets can be traced, when can they be traced, and in more complicated situations, trying to work out whose assets are actually being used is a difficult question, and there are certain rules you can apply when tracing these assets. Number 5 is a question of traceable assets. So what can you trace into? What type of assets can someone actually trace their value into? Now that's an interesting question because it could involve third-party assets, for example, or it could involve assets which are not necessarily the same as the original asset which the person had. So this is an interesting question. Number 6 is proprietary remedy. Now, I've put this in here because often when you're tracing in order to get some sort of remedy. So you're tracing for a proprietary remedy, potentially, in most cases. Now, different remedies or different claims might be available depending on what asset you've traced into and the circumstances. Now, I should have maybe put in brackets here personal remedy, because you can often trace for a personal remedy as well, so that's also something to consider. And number 7 is defense. Now, I put this at the bottom because there are a number of defenses which can be used, but they can apply throughout the stages of this tracing process, so I've put it at the end, but it's worth considering throughout. So, just a couple of final points to note in this introduction to tracing. So the first is tracing for a claim. So tracing in itself is not actually a claim. Just by tracing the assets, this does not necessarily mean that the beneficiary has made a claim, but instead you could consider it as a prerequisite for the beneficiary being able to make a claim. So although tracing will often lead to a claim, it's not necessarily the same thing. Now the second point I've noted here is tracing and problem questions. Now this is just more a practical note for the videos here. I'm going to first lay out the rules of tracing very briefly, just so you have a brief idea of what they are. But then I'm actually going to walk through a number of problem questions which I've written to show how these work together, which will better describe how the rules can work in practice and what to look out for in a problem question. So this first video here has been very brief, simply introducing what tracing is, and in the next video I will go through the actual rules of tracing before looking at some problem questions. So I hope this has been useful and thank you for watching. And as always, if you have any questions or comments or would like further information and resources, please contact me at thelawguide@outlook.com. Thank you for watching.